The night was unnaturally still. Corporal Helmut Richter shifted his rifle against the damp strap of his uniform and glanced across the dark ribbon of water. The Black Kong Canal lay under the stars, the wooden planks of the bridge groaning softly as if remembering the weight of the trucks and boots that crossed it all day. He rubbed his eyes. They said the invasion would come someday, but not tonight, not here. He had been told to listen for the drone of bombers or the chop of parachutes filling the air. His instructors had laughed at the Allied gliders, which were flimsy plywood and canvas frames pulled behind real aircraft like toys. "Fool's coffins," a Luftwaffe pilot had said in the barracks weeks earlier. "No wings, no power, no future. They will fall apart before they reach us." Richter had chuckled along. Yet, in that moment by the bridge, he did not hear a drone or roar. It was a whisper, a faint rustling above, like the sweep of owls' wings. He tilted his head and frowned into the sky. Nothing, just the tremor of the night. Then came the crash. Behind the tree line, no more than 100 yards from his post, something massive tore through the branches. Timber cracked, and the earth shuddered. Richter staggered, his heart racing. Another crash followed, then another, each one closer and sharper than the last. His mind groped for explanations. Bombs? No, too soft. Tanks? Impossible. Then he saw them, dark hulks against the meadow, with snapped wings and noses buried in the soil. They were shapes that should not have been there, and that no motor had announced. Out of the wreckage, men poured forth, their faces streaked and their weapons ready. British helmets gleamed in the moonlight. They sprinted with silent discipline toward the bridge. One raised his Sten gun and fired into the nearest bunker. Bullets sparked. Richter scrambled for his rifle, his throat dry. They had arrived without sound or warning. The invasion had arrived, carried on wings of silence. Miles away, Sergeant Jim Walwork gritted his teeth as his Horsa bucked in the slipstream. The tow cable had just snapped free. For an instant, his cockpit was filled with nothing but the rush of air. He felt the sudden lightness of freedom. Ahead lay only blackness. There were no lights or landmarks, just trust in the compass, in his training, and in the hours spent rehearsing in English meadows designed to resemble this French village. "Steady," he muttered to his co-pilot. The Horsa's wide wings sliced silently through the night, like a giant moth gliding earthward. To Walwork's ears, every creak of the wooden struts sounded like thunder, though he knew the ground below would hear nothing. He searched for the faint glimmer of water, the canal that would guide him. Then it appeared, a darker ribbon against the black. He aligned the nose, his heart pounding. 30 men of D Company sat tense behind him, hands gripping rifles and grenades. They knew that within minutes they would either seize the bridge or die beside it. "Hold on." Walwork pulled the stick. The Horsa skimmed the treetops, its wings being slashed by branches. Then the meadow opened up. It was barely large enough and hardly smooth enough. The wheels slammed down and the fuselage jolted. Wood splintered, and men cursed as the nose dug deep. But the glider held. It had delivered them intact, within yards of their target. The ramp flew open. First out was Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, his boots pounding the grass and his voice cutting the night. "Come on, lads!" They stormed toward the bridge, bayonets fixed, erupting from silence into violence like shadows. Richter barely had time to fire a shot before bullets stitched the sandbags around him. He dropped flat, stunned by the speed. He had expected hours of warning, parachutes drifting, and sirens wailing. Instead, 3 wooden gliders had dropped soldiers directly onto his doorstep, closer than any bomber could have aimed. The bridge he was supposed to guard, a lifeline for German reinforcements, was already swarming with enemy soldiers. Within 10 minutes, the fight was over. The charges set to demolish the bridge were cut. The German garrison was either dead or captured. The Allies held the crossing. As Richter was led away in the gray dawn, he glanced at the fields one last time. The wrecked gliders lay there, their wings broken, but their mission complete. He thought bitterly of the pilot who had mocked them weeks before. Fools' coffins? No, tonight they had been daggers, thrown in silence and finding their mark with impossible precision. In the first hour of D-Day, the laughter stopped. The silent wings had arrived, bringing with them the collapse of Germany's faith in its own certainty. Sometimes the loudest sound in war is the absence of engines. The hangar in Troy, Ohio, reeked of glue and sawdust. Under the glare of hanging lamps, rows of young men and women bent over wooden frames, stretching canvas, hammering rivets, and sanding ribs. To a visitor, it looked less like a war factory and more like a workshop for oversized kites. The product on the assembly line had no engine, armor, or guns, just wood, fabric, and the promise of flight. "Doesn't look like much, does it?" a foreman told a reporter in 1943 while wiping sweat from his forehead. He slapped the frame gently. "Give it wings, and it'll carry a jeep, or 13 armed men, or a howitzer. That's not nothing." The Waco CG-4A Hadrian was America's answer to a question that few people thought was worth asking. How can you drop not just men, but also their weapons directly into enemy territory? The Germans experimented early on, crashing gliders into Belgian forts. The British refined the concept with their Horsa and Hamilcar gliders. But the Americans turned it into an industry. By the time plans were finalized, contracts were spread across 22 manufacturers. Even furniture companies were enlisted, including Ford and Cessna. The design was simple, a steel tube fuselage with plywood sides and a fabric skin. The nose swung open to accommodate a Jeep or a 75mm pack howitzer. 2 pilots, trained not to fight, but to crash land precisely, guided the aircraft down. 13 soldiers crouched behind them in silence, ready to leap into chaos. At its peak, nearly 1,000 gliders were produced per month. By mid-1944, over 13,900 had been built. They were a flood of wings with no motors, each destined to be towed into war and abandoned after one flight. They were the ultimate disposable weapon. To German pilots, the idea was absurd. Luftwaffe officers sneered at the idea of spending money and manpower on plywood coffins. They joked that the Americans must be desperate to build planes without engines. One officer quipped, "It's better to send soldiers in cardboard boxes." But the Americans did not laugh. They did the math. A C-47 towing a glider could deliver 25 men, a jeep, and a gun, far more than parachutes alone. Dropped from 1,000 feet, the glider glided silently through the darkness until it touched the ground. Parachutes scattered troops across miles. Gliders, on the other hand, concentrated them in fields, often just yards from their objectives. Captain Harold Clark, an instructor at the Laurinburg-Maxton Army Air Base in North Carolina, vividly remembered the first night flight. No engine, just wind. You could hear the men breathing behind you. Then you could hear the creak of the frame, the rush of the dive, and the slam of the landing. When the ramp dropped, they spilled out like ghosts. That's when I realized that this silly wooden bird was a weapon. The pilots were a breed apart. They trained not to return, not to climb again, but to land once. Many called themselves the Suicide Squadron, though they were officially the Army Air Force's Glider Pilot Regiment. Their task was brutal: guide 7 tons of wood and men through flak and darkness, hit a meadow barely large enough for a barn, and survive the wreck. Then, if they lived, they had to fight on foot as infantry. One veteran later explained, "We were half pilots and half crash test dummies, but when we put a jeep and a gun right into the middle of a fight, nobody mocked us anymore." The numbers spoke louder than ridicule. On June 6, 1944, more than 500 gliders carried American troops into Normandy as part of a larger Allied assault that employed nearly 1,000 gliders within 24 hours. Each glider was a bundle of plywood wings meant to break on French soil. Factories back home churned them out so quickly that workers joked, "We're building more wings than birds." The Army told them the truth. Each wing meant that a soldier might survive the first hour of the invasion. Each glider ensured that a gun would fire in the right place, a jeep would travel on the right road, and a radio would work in the dark. The Germans had laughed. But in June, when the night was filled with silent shadows, the laughter ended. Sometimes the deadliest plane is the one that only has to fly once. The night was thick with fog and fear. Flight Officer Peter Boyle wiped the sweat from his palms and tightened his grip on the control yoke. His Horsa creaked like an old ship, its canvas skin humming against the wind. 30 paratroopers of the 9th Battalion, their faces striped with camouflage, crouched in silence behind him. They knew their objective, the Merville Battery, with its 4 heavy guns pointed at Sword Beach. Boyle felt the sudden tug when the Halifax bomber ahead cut the tow rope. The silence struck like a blow. 1 second, the engine's roar filled the cockpit. The next, nothing but the rush of air. He was alone in a wooden box gliding into darkness. Below he caught a glimpse of the pale glimmer of the Orne River. Then the black quilt of Norman fields. He leaned forward, his eyes straining. They had warned him. Rommel's men had planted poles in every meadow, tall stakes meant to rip open wings and kill gliders before they could land. He prayed for a gap. The altimeter spun down. He pulled gently, aiming for what looked like a clearing. The ground surged up, then the hard impact. Wood splintered, and metal screamed. The horse's nose plowed into the soil, throwing the men forward. Boyle's head smacked the canopy and stars burst in his eyes. But the fuselage held. Shouts filled the hold. The ramp slammed open. The paratroopers surged out, rifles raised, like ghosts born from silence. Inside the concrete casemate of the Merville Battery, Feldwebel Karl Weber jerked his head up. He had heard the earlier bombardment, shells pounding and earth shaking, but it had passed. Now only the drone of distant planes remained. He wiped dust from his map and muttered, "Another raid." Then came the thud. Not a shell. Too close. Too heavy. Another thud followed, and then another. He frowned and stepped outside into the night. His heart jolted. Shapes loomed in the fields beyond the wire. Broken wings stuck out like fallen crosses. Men in strange helmets were sprinting toward him, their boots whispering on the grass. They hadn't fallen from parachutes. They had landed intact. Weber shouted an alarm. Machine guns chattered. Tracers cut through the darkness. Yet the enemy kept coming, climbing through the barbed wire and hurling grenades into the firing slits. He ducked as an explosion shook the earth and his ears rang. His comrades fired blindly, but the attackers were already inside the perimeter. A British sergeant jammed a Bangalore torpedo into the wire. Sparks hissed, and then an explosion tore open a path. The commandos surged through, bayonets flashing. Weber saw one of his gunners cut down in the embrasure and another dragged from a pit. He raised his pistol and fired once, then twice. Suddenly he was slammed to the ground and his weapon was kicked away. A boot pressed against his chest and a cold barrel pressed against his jaw. By dawn, the battery was a ruin. 3 of the 4 guns had been destroyed with explosives. Bodies lay scattered across trenches and fields among the wreckage of gliders, torn apart by stakes and earth. Fewer than half of the British attackers made it back. But the battery was silent. Its shells would never be fired on Sword Beach. Boyle limped away from his shattered Horsa, holding an arm against a bleeding wound. He turned once, staring at the wrecked wings jutting from the ground. To him, they looked less like failures and more like sacrifices. The gliders had died in the right place. Their silence had carried men straight into the heart of the enemy. The Germans were completely shocked. They had prepared for slowly drifting parachutes and bombardments from the sky. They had not prepared for soldiers arriving in one piece, riding silent wings. Later, a survivor of the battery admitted, "We heard no engines or bombs, only the crash. Then they were among us." Sometimes the most terrifying weapon is not the one that roars overhead, but the one that falls silently and breaks through your door before you realize it is there. The C-47's lights vanished in an instant. The tow rope snapped free, and suddenly the cockpit was filled with silence. Lieutenant Charles Myers gripped the control stick of his Waco CG-4A and peered into the darkness. There was no moon, just a smear of clouds over Normandy. 13 paratroopers hunched together behind him, faces painted and weapons clutched. One of them muttered a prayer, his words trembling in the still air. "Chicago mission," Myers whispered to himself, forcing calm into his voice. It was just after midnight on June 6th. Their mission was to deliver heavy equipment to the 101st Airborne Division. The paratroopers were already scattering across the fields. Myers's job was to provide them with the necessary equipment, jeeps, radios, and even a 57mm anti-tank gun. Without these supplies, the men with rifles would be overrun by German armor at dawn. The glider groaned as he dipped through the clouds, its wooden struts flexing. His altimeter spun downward. He saw nothing but dark fields stitched with hedgerows, the bocage country of Normandy, which was lethal to land in. They had been warned. Rommel's asparagus, poles sunk into meadows and wired with mines waiting to impale wings. "Hold on," Myers shouted back. The Waco lurched, then impact. The right wing clipped a hedgerow and snapped like matchwood. The fuselage spun, the nose plowing into the earth. Men were thrown forward, their shouts and curses mingling with the shriek of tearing canvas. Dust filled the cabin. When it stopped, silence again filled the air. Broken wings sprawled across a Norman field. Then movement. The ramp dropped. Soldiers staggered out, one dragging a crate and another clutching a shattered arm. A jeep tumbled from the nose of the plane and landed in the dirt, nose first, but it was still intact. A paratrooper slapped its hood. "She's good! Get her moving!" In the chaos, even damaged cargo was valuable. 2 miles away, another glider slammed into a hedgerow nose first. Inside was Brigadier General Don Pratt, the 101st's deputy commander. His Waco, overloaded with gear, broke apart upon landing. Pratt was killed instantly, his body pinned under twisted struts. News of his death spread quickly through the division. The general, who had insisted on leading from the front, had become one of the first American officers to die on D-Day. For the glider troops, it was a brutal reminder that their aircraft did not forgive mistakes. But even amid the wreckage, supplies trickled through. By dawn, several anti-tank guns had been assembled and hauled into position near causeways leading off Utah Beach. Glider jeeps carried radios that linked the scattered paratroopers. Ammunition crates were stacked in orchards and guarded by men who had crawled from the wreckage only hours earlier. Captain James Hayes of the 82nd Airborne Division later wrote, "If not for the gliders, we would have had rifles and courage. With them, we had a chance against tanks." To the villagers of Normandy, it was surreal. A farmer near Sainte-Mère-Église later told his son, "The night was quiet, and then the sky hissed. Wings, but no motors. They landed in our fields like ghosts. Some burned and some broke, but the men came out alive. It was as if war had learned to fly without sound." German soldiers rushed to investigate the crashes. They found the wreck scattered across meadows and orchards, but there were always footprints leading away, dragging crates and pulling wheels. Each wreck meant more than just lost plywood. It meant fresh enemy weapons spreading through the hedgerows. The Germans had only expected parachutists. They had not expected jeeps to roll out of broken wings or guns to be wheeled from splintered boxes. By dawn on June 6th, the Chicago and Detroit missions had landed over 100 gliders in the darkness. Many were smashed. Some pilots lay dead in their seats, but enough survived. Enough brought weapons, radios, and mobility to the scattered paratroopers. They made the first American footholds more than just scattered men in hedgerows. For the glider pilots, the night was brutal. Each crash cost lives. Each successful landing provided a division with the means to survive the first day. Sometimes history turns not on the planes that roar, but on those that whisper. The sun was setting over Normandy, and a haze of smoke was turning the sky copper. In the fields behind Utah Beach, paratroopers crouched in hedgerows, exhausted and with hot rifles from skirmishes. They had held crossroads and causeways all day, but they knew tanks could come at dusk. What they lacked was firepower. Off the coast, the sky suddenly filled with black dots. More than 200 gliders, released from tow planes, banked inland in waves. They were the Elmira and the Keokuk, evening missions designed to bring the weight of a division down from the sky. Inside a Waco glider, Corporal Henry Wilson wiped the sweat from his palms and looked at the gun lashed in front of him. It was a 57mm anti-tank piece with its wheels tied and its barrel wedged tight. Crates of shells around it rattled with every gust of wind. Wilson and his crew crouched with their helmets low, waiting. "Get ready," the pilot barked. 2 minutes. The glider shuddered as flak bloomed outside, black puffs against the fading sky. The pilots hunched low and guided the plywood wings through bursts of fire. The glider's silence was no longer a shield. The enemy could now see them clearly, hundreds at once, descending on the Norman fields. Wilson gritted his teeth. He had heard stories of morning crashes, of men being torn apart in orchards. But tonight, he told himself, they had to succeed. The infantry was waiting, and the panzers would not wait long. Impact! The Waco slammed into a hedgerow, its wheels bouncing and its nose digging into the dirt. The gun lurched forward, straining the ropes. Men shouted. The fuselage creaked, then settled. The ramp dropped. Wilson and his crew tumbled out and grabbed the gun's trail legs. They heaved it onto the grass. They rolled it clear, crates clattering after them. All around them, other gliders slammed into fields, some smoothly, others violently. Jeeps roared to life as they pulled free from their wooden shells. Ammunition tins were piled high. Engineers shouted as they unloaded explosives and mines. By twilight, the hedgerows buzzed with the clamor of a suddenly heavier army. Lieutenant John McCabe of the 101st Airborne Division later recalled that moment. "All day we had rifles and bazookas, and we prayed that tanks wouldn't come. At dusk, the fields cracked open and jeeps and guns spilled out. It was like Christmas delivered by wings." The scale was staggering. Between Elmira and Keokuk, more than 200 gliders landed in a few hours, delivering dozens of anti-tank guns, jeeps, and tons of ammunition. Many smashed against trees or poles, resulting in heavy losses, but enough cargo survived. The paratroopers' thin line was suddenly studded with teeth. From the German side, the effect was jarring. A sergeant near Carentan reported, "At dusk, the sky filled with unmotorized machines. They came in silence until they hit the ground. Then, weapons poured out. It was as if the earth itself had given the enemy more strength." By midnight, the causeways from Utah Beach were secure. Convoys moved inland, guided by paratroopers. The American line held not only because the men fought hard, but also because plywood wings had carried their guns to them. The pilots of Elmira and Keokuk called it the hardest mission of their lives. Daylight meant they could not hide. Flak tore through wings, mines littered the fields, and poles ripped open fuselages. However, those who landed alive often joined the fight with rifles in hand, fighting alongside the men they had delivered. One wrote home, "I was trained to crash a plane, but when I saw the gun firing at panzers an hour after we landed, I knew the crash had been worth it." Sometimes the outcome of war is not decided in the initial assault, but rather in the reinforcements that arrive when the enemy thinks you are spent. On June 6th, it was the silent wings of Elmira and Keokuk that gave the paratroopers of Normandy the strength to endure. On June 7th, dawn came with a gray sky and the stench of smoke still hanging over the hedgerows. The beaches behind Utah were already jammed with ships, cranes unloading supplies and bulldozers carving roads into the sand. Inland, the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Divisions held crossroads, villages, and bridges. but just barely. Ammunition was low, radios were burned out, and some units were still scattered. The Germans prepared counterattacks. Then the sky filled again. Not with bombers or fighters, but with more of the ungainly wooden aircraft that had carried the first waves. Galveston and Hackensack, 2 more missions, 1 more gamble with silence. Inside his cockpit, Lieutenant Bill Rankin rubbed his temples. He hadn't slept in 30 hours. His Waco was loaded with cargo crates and an engineer squad carrying picks, explosives, and satchels. He thought of the nickname that pilots had given themselves, Crash Corps. For them, it was never a question of if they would crash, only how. The tug released them over the French coast. Once again the engines faded into emptiness. Rankin felt the familiar loneliness of being just a frame of plywood and canvas gliding earthward. Below, the Norman countryside stretched out like deadly patchwork. Hedgerows, poles, wires, and streams waiting to tear the plane apart. "Brace!" he barked. The Waco dipped, cleared a hedgerow by mere feet, and then slammed down in a meadow. Dust blasted through the cabin, the nose splintered. Men cursed. But the fuselage held, and the ramp fell. Sappers climbed out, dragging gear and checking each other for injuries. One man kissed the earth and muttered, "We made it." Meanwhile, in another meadow, Sergeant Paul Anders grunted as he and his crew rolled a 75mm pack howitzer out of a wrecked glider. The landing had shattered the left wing, but the gun was intact. They set it up at the edge of the field, sweating under the June sun. Within an hour, it fired its first round toward German positions, probing near Sainte-Mère-Église. By noon, the fields, once scattered with wrecks, were alive with activity. Jeeps bounced along dirt lanes, radios crackled with fresh signals, and medics carried stretchers into improvised aid stations. Engineers blew gaps in bocage walls to carve lanes for tanks pushing inland from the beach. Every tool and crate came from gliders that had crashed in the grass. On the German side, disbelief turned to dread. A corporal in the 91st Infantry Division wrote later, "We thought they would run out. We thought the paratroopers only had what they carried. But each day, more boxes came from the sky. They weren't finished. They were building." Rommel's asparagus, the forest of poles planted to destroy gliders, had claimed some victims. Planes were skewered, wings were torn, and men were killed before they touched the earth. But enough made it through. By June 7th, the American foothold in Normandy looked less like a fragile patch of paratroopers and more like a fortress supplied from the sky. For the pilots, exhaustion was total. They had flown wave after wave, some landing, some crashing, and some disappearing without a trace. Those who stumbled out of wrecked cockpits, however, often picked up rifles and joined the nearest squad. One glider pilot scrawled in his diary, "I was meant to crash a plane. Now I'm digging foxholes. Either way, I guess I'm where I need to be." By June 7th, hundreds more tons of equipment had been delivered, including howitzers, mortars, radios, engineer supplies, and rations. The paratroopers' lines were no longer a thread. They were a rope, thickening with every load. Galveston and Hackensack lacked the drama of Pegasus Bridge or the chaos of the night drops, but they were important nonetheless. But without them, the American bridgehead would have faltered. Courage alone did not hold Normandy together. Jeeps, guns, and ammunition rolled out of silent wings as well. Sometimes history does not turn on a single heroic charge, but on the steady arrival of supplies carried not by glory, but by plywood. The Hamilcar was a giant among gliders. While the Waco looked like a box and the Horsa looked like a bus, the Hamilcar looked like a barn with wings. 40 feet long and 60 feet wide, it was built to carry the unthinkable, a tank. Flight Officer Alan Harding sat in its vast cockpit, sweat dripping into his eyes. Behind him, in the cavernous cargo hold, a Tetrarch light tank sat, its turret strapped down and its crew crouched beside it. The idea was madness. Tanks belonged on ships, not inside wooden shells. But tonight, over Normandy, it was real. The Halifax tug roared ahead, straining against the load. Harding checked his gauges. The Hamilcar shuddered, its canvas skin rattling under the pull. He glanced back. The tank's nose glinted in the dim light, looking absurdly still. "Flying a bloody barn," he muttered. At 3:30 a.m. the rope snapped free, engines faded, silence fell. Harding guided the aircraft forward, aiming for a meadow near Ranville. The altimeter spun, air rushed in. He whispered a prayer to the machine. Impact. The Hamilcar slammed down, skidding across the grass and tearing through bushes. Wood cracked and struts bent, but it stopped upright. Harding let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Behind him, the tank roared to life. The nose ramp dropped. The Tetrarch clanked forward, its tracks grinding and exhaust spitting. Harding stared in disbelief as the machine rolled into the Norman dawn. The tank's commander, Lieutenant David Holbrook, felt his stomach lurch as they bumped free of the glider. "God help us. We're driving in France," he muttered. His Tetrarch wasn't much, barely 10 tons, armor no thicker than a rifle plate, and a gun smaller than those of German panzers. But for the men of the 6th Airborne Division, it was a tank. It was weight. It was proof that they weren't alone with just rifles and grenades. The tank lumbered down a dirt track, passing astonished paratroopers who cheered as if they were witnessing a miracle. "Bloody hell, we've got tanks," one shouted. Holbrook saluted grimly. He knew the tank was fragile, but in that moment it was invincible, a symbol more than a weapon. On the German side, disbelief rippled through the ranks. Hauptmann Otto Renner of the 716th Division later told interrogators, "We saw tracks in the mud and thought it was impossible. A tank cannot fall from the sky. Yet there it was, small but real, its gun pointing at us." For the soldiers who had mocked gliders as plywood toys, the shock was brutal. First came infantry out of wooden shells. Now came tanks. The numbers were modest. Only a handful of Tetrarchs flew in on D-Day, and many were damaged or got stuck in the sand. In combat, they were no match for German armor. But the symbolism was huge. For the first time in history, tanks had been landed by air. For the defenders of Normandy, it was one more certainty shattered. Exhausted, Harding leaned against his wrecked Hamilcar as the sun rose. His job was done. He had delivered not men or crates, but a tank, by glider. Paratroopers marched past him, rifles ready. He chuckled bitterly. "They called us plywood fools," he muttered, "but we just flew a tank into battle." Sometimes victory isn't about the strength of a weapon, but the imagination to bring it where no one believes it can go. The fields of Normandy looked like graveyards long before the Allies arrived. All spring, French villagers had watched German soldiers hammer poles into the meadows, row after row, until every clearing bristled like a forest of spears. Children whispered that the fields had grown teeth. The soldiers called it Rommel's asparagus. Corporal Ernst Huber spent weeks driving stakes into the ground. He was an engineer trained in building bridges and bunkers, but now his task was to farm death. He and his men carried timber poles sharpened to points, sinking them deep and lacing them with wires and mines. They were told it would stop the enemy's silent wings. Rommel himself had ordered it. Gliders, he insisted, were a menace. At Eben-Emael in 1940, German gliders had humiliated the Belgians. He would not allow for the same surprise again. Thus, thousands of asparagus plants were planted across fields and pastures, ready to rip wings and spill men across Norman soil. Huber believed it. Every hammer stroke felt like insurance. When the invasion came, he thought, the sky would be filled with wreckage. Flight Officer Tom Patterson only saw the stakes in the last second. His Horsa, heavy with paratroopers, glided low through the mist. The meadow below looked flat and promising. Then he saw the shadows, hundreds of poles thrust upward. "Jesus Christ!" he hissed, jerking the stick. Too late. The left wing struck a pole, the canvas ripped, and the struts cracked. The glider slewed sideways. Men shouted as the fuselage slammed into the ground, skidding through the deadly garden. Wood split and metal screamed. The nose snapped off, throwing the bodies forward. Yet the glider did not disintegrate. The ramp fell. Stunned soldiers crawled out, dragging their rifles and stumbling among the broken stakes. A sergeant kicked a pole aside and barked, "Move! The battery won't wait." They limped toward their target, bloodied but alive. Across Normandy, dozens of gliders met the same fate, wings torn, hulls cracked, and men killed before touching ground. The asparagus field claimed its toll, but not enough. Hundreds still landed intact. Hundreds of soldiers poured out of them, carrying guns and radios and forming ranks in the dark. At dawn, Captain Friedrich Langen of the 716th Division surveyed a meadow near Ranville. His eyes widened. He had expected to see piles of wreckage and broken plywood, as well as corpses tangled in splinters. Instead, he saw both wreckage and footprints. Ammo crates were scattered, and wheels had dragged across furrows. Jeeps had rolled straight out of shattered wings. Guns were already firing from the hedgerows. His asparagus stood tall, many poles intact. But the enemy had landed anyway, between them, among them, and sometimes on top of them. Langen muttered bitterly, "We planted a forest, but they came through like ghosts." Rommel's trap failed not because it was poorly designed, but because the Allies refused to respect it. They aimed their gliders as close to their targets as possible, regardless of the risk. For every glider torn open by a stake, another landed close enough to matter. For every dead pilot, another brought men within yards of their objective. Later, a German officer wrote in his report, "The obstacles were not decisive. They caused losses, yes, but the enemy still arrived where he wished. It is not enough to wound a wing when the mission succeeds anyway." For the men on the ground, the sight was unforgettable. Fields studded with poles and wrecked gliders, some burning, some silent, and soldiers already moving away with rifles raised. The asparagus had not been a wall, it had been a thicket. Thickets can be pushed through. Sometimes the strongest defense is not one built of wood and wire, but one that never lets the enemy get close. In Normandy, Rommel's asparagus proved only one thing: silence cannot be fenced out. In the chaos of Normandy, what you could carry mattered most. A rifle and a few clips could win a skirmish, but to hold ground against tanks and artillery, more was needed. The paratroopers knew this on the night of June 6th. They dropped into hedgerows with courage and grit, but little else. What allowed them to establish a foothold were the supplies that arrived on silent wings. Private Jack Harmon of the 101st Airborne Division recalled the moment in disbelief. His platoon had spent the morning crouched in a ditch near Causeway 2. They were short on ammo and stared at the distant dust clouds of German armor. Then, a soundless shape scraped into a meadow behind them, a battered Waco CG-4A with a cracked nose and flapping canvas. The ramp fell. Out rolled a jeep, its engine coughing to life. Two sappers jumped from the wreck, shouting, "She still runs!" Harmon swore he felt stronger, just seeing the wheels. "We'd been on our feet all night," he said later. "Now we had a machine. We weren't just hiding in hedgerows. We could move." Meanwhile, in another field, Corporal Raymond Ellis and his crew unstrapped a 57mm anti-tank gun from the remains of a glider. They rolled it clear and set it up at the edge of an orchard. Hours later, when a German half-track rumbled down the road, Ellis barked, "Fire!" The shell shrieked, struck the vehicle, and it burst into flames. That gun, Ellis told his grandson decades later, rode in on plywood. Without it, we would have been overrun before noon. By the end of June 6th, dozens of such guns had been dragged from broken wings. They gave scattered infantry the power to face armor, thin lines hardened into walls. Not all cargo was steel. Captain Joseph Lanza, a medic, sprinted to a glider wreck where crates had spilled onto the grass. He pried one open. Inside were morphine vials, bandages, and plasma, everything his field hospital lacked. Until then, he had been tying wounds with shirts and praying that the men would last the night. Now he could treat them properly. He never forgot that these supplies had come not by parachute, but by silent crash. The gliders brought blood, he said. Without them, I'd have lost twice as many. The radios mattered just as much. The paratroopers in the bocage were cut off and scattered for miles. However, the gliders carried jeep-mounted radios and heavy transmitters that were impossible to drop by parachute. By the morning of June 7th, Sainte-Mère-Église headquarters was communicating with ships offshore and divisions miles apart. A network of voices stitched the invasion together, born from plywood wings. The Germans saw the effect. Sergeant Otto Grün, captured near Carentan, told his interrogators, "We thought we were facing paratroopers only, lightly armed, easy to push back. But suddenly they had guns, vehicles, and radios. We asked, where did these come from? The answer was, from the sky, in wooden boxes." The arithmetic was clear. In the first 48 hours of D-Day, American gliders delivered over 50 anti-tank guns, 37mm and 57mm, hundreds of jeeps, tons of ammunition, field radios and signal equipment, medical supplies, and medics. Each item meant survival. Each crate doubled the strength of the men holding crossroads and causeways. For the pilots, the cargo was as real as the lives it saved. Flight Officer Myers, who had barely survived a crash landing, wrote later, "I didn't just deliver plywood, I delivered a gun that stopped a tank, a jeep that carried the wounded, and a radio that called in ships. That's worth a crash." By June 7th, the scattered paratroopers were more than just men with rifles in hedgerows. They had transportation, artillery, medical supplies, and communication equipment. They had the backbone of an army. They owed this not to roaring bombers, but to the fragile machines that whispered through the night and shattered in the fields. Sometimes history isn't written by the biggest weapon, but by the box that carries it to the right place at the right time. They had laughed. In 1943, German pilots in Luftwaffe mess halls jeered at the American obsession with gliders. "Planes without engines," they sneered, "flying coffins, a waste of wood." They compared the gliders to toys and coffins on wings. One captain declared, "Against flak, they are tinder. Against fighters, they are prey. Only fools would ride them." But the laughter died in the first hours of June 6, 1944. At Bénouville, British gliders slammed into meadows beside the Orne Canal, delivering paratroopers who seized Pegasus Bridge before dawn. At Merville, broken horses dropped paratroopers directly into the path of the German battery, silencing the guns that threatened Sword Beach. Over Utah, Wacos dropped jeeps and anti-tank guns into the bocage, transforming scattered riflemen into an armed division. By dusk, Elmira and Keokuk had poured artillery and engineers across the fields of Normandy. On June 7th, Galveston and Hackensack transformed footholds into fortresses. The German joke about flying coffins had become a bitter truth. Indeed, gliders often killed their own pilots. Yes, they shattered on hedgerows and poles. But they delivered what mattered most: men, guns, radios, and even tanks, exactly where and when they were needed. Oberleutnant Hans Keller, a Luftwaffe pilot who was captured later in 1944, admitted, "We laughed at them. But the bridges we lost on June 6th were not lost to bombers. They were lost to men who stepped out of silent wings." On the ground, survivors carried their own memories. Private Harry Lomas of the Oxenbucks Regiment stood on Pegasus Bridge that dawn, the wreck of a Horsa glider smoking behind him. "We came in on wood and canvas," he recalled, "but we left with a bridge, and that made all the difference." American pilot Charles Myers, who survived a crash landing with broken ribs, put it more grimly, "I was trained to fly and crash well once. That night, I crashed into Normandy. The men I carried fought on. That's all that mattered." The scale was staggering. By the end of the war, the United States had built nearly 14,000 CG-4A gliders, and Britain had built thousands of Horsas and hundreds of Hamilcars. On D-Day alone, nearly 1,000 gliders carried more than 7,500 men and countless tons of equipment into France. It was the largest glider operation in history. The cost was high. Many never made it. Crews died in silence as their machines splintered into orchards and fields, but their sacrifice changed the course of the war. Paratroopers did not fight alone. They fought alongside jeeps, guns, radios, and tanks that were delivered by silent wings. The Germans learned this too late. None of their obstacles, ridicule, or poles could stop an idea once it gained momentum. The Feiner boxes had become daggers in the night, carving open the Atlantic wall from within. Ultimately, the lesson of D-Day's silent wings is simple. Power does not always roar. Sometimes it glides. Victory does not always come from the strongest steel or the loudest engine. Sometimes it comes from the fragile craft that dares to land in darkness and deliver men straight to the heart of the fight. The Germans had mocked America's gliders, but when 13,000 silent wings touched down in France, the mockery ended.